to see you all here today. Today we're delighted to welcome a visiting professor, our fellow speaker for the fall, Dr. J. Michael Dean. He's professor and vice chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Utah School of Medicine. He went to Northwestern for medical school and completed his pediatric residency and chief residency at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles before completing a critical care fellowship at Johns Hopkins. His current research interests relate to outcomes after pediatric critical and emergency care, and he's the PI for a number of really interesting projects, including the National EMSC Data Analysis Resource Center, and is also the PI for the Pediatric Critical Care Scientist Development Program and the Data Coordinating Center for the Collaborative Pediatric Critical Care Research Network, and is also the PI for the Data Coordinating Center of the recently funded NHLBI Therapeutic Hypothermia After Pediatric Cardiac Arrest trials. So we are delighted to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dean.
Thank you. Does this mic work? Yeah, it sounds like it's working. I can even hear myself. The biography that my secretary sent out was an old biography because the recently funded THAPCA trials were just recently published and after 8 years. And so, but thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm going to give a talk here that is entitled Clinical Research, Dead or Alive. And I know that there are multiple audiences in this room. There are some very experienced leaders of DCRI in the room, and then there are some fellows in the room and a smattering of people that are in between. And I'm going to do the difficult task of trying to thread a piece of thread through the needle of making all of you dissatisfied. So if I do all of that, then I will have perhaps succeeded in doing this. I am the vice chair of the Department of Pediatrics for Research, and as vice chair, my job is primarily really to encourage physician scientists to not go extinct, and that's going to be sort of the theme of my talk as we go through here. But I'm including in clinical research anything that involves patients. So I don't just mean randomized trials, I don't mean observational cohort studies. I try not to mean medical record reviews because I find that to be a distinct squandering of a young physician scientist or medical student's time for no purpose. But anything that involves, this isn't going to work anyway, the pointer doesn't matter. And physician scientists who are working in the laboratory are also included in this because I think that the combination of physician and scientist is really the most important thing that we need to keep in mind. And I know that at the DCRI you don't have a lot of mouse work that's going on in the building, I presume. But for this talk, clinical research is any research that involves clinical staff and carrying it out. This is my mission in life. I go around the country talking about this, and I'm old enough that I can retire when I stop having fun. My mission in life is to tell people that clinical research is not dead. And, you know, there are pessimistic pediatric leaders. I have heard some very senior leaders say R01s are dead, or the NIH is dead, or we've got to give up research from our department because we can't keep it in the mission. And you can see what I think about them. I think they should keep their mouths shut because I think that if you send a pessimistic message to people, you will achieve your goal of getting a pessimistic output. And I think the goal that we should have is to make sure that physician scientists are preserved. The NIH is not dead. I'll show you some slides later. Even with our current administration, the sky was going to fall, Trump was elected, we're going to lose billions and billions of dollars. The NIH budget went up. So we just have to keep in mind the facts on the ground and separate that from the hysteria that sometimes is in the news. Dean's Law was named after Dean. I'm Dean. I was the chair at the University of Utah from 1994 to 96, and I made the comment that if you don't fill out the forms, you don't get the award. So if you don't write a grant application, you're not going to get a grant. And it was named Dean's Law then, and this is sort of one of the favorite jokes in our Department of Pediatrics. And then again, physician scientists are critical. You're the levers between, most of you are physicians, I'm presuming, but physicians are the levers, as are nurses, between the researchers and the patients. And if we don't have those levers or those connections, then all of our clinical research enterprise is toasted. So I'm going to give you a little bit of my background because it's bizarre. It's bizarre enough that it matches some of the people that I met with yesterday. I was interested in high school in science, and I worked in a lab where molecular biology consisted of knocking a block of ice of E. coli off of the a huge container of E. coli, and then we melted the E. coli and did all sorts of things. We never thought that the mammalian genome would ever be approachable. This is in the mid-60s. I did clinical research. I did my obligatory medical record review when I was a resident, and hope to never, and I know I will never do another one. I just hope that none of you ever do one. I went to Johns Hopkins. I worked in a cerebrovascular lab. I was very interested in ischemia. I did basic science research for 7 years. I then moved to Utah. I set up a lab to continue to do that, but I realized that I couldn't do that effectively with all my administrative jobs, and so I got into the emergency medical services for children and databases, which took me into probabilistic database linkage with crash records. And from there, because we had expertise with databases in EMSC, we became the Data Analysis Resource Center for the country for EMS. And I should have named this instead of data, this was the National EMSC Data Analysis Resource Center. I should have called it the National EMSC Research Analysis Center, and then we would have been called NERDAC, which is more appropriate. NEDARC and CODES became another big technical assistance center for automotive crashes. We have huge databases that we manage. We put this all together and became a coordinating center in about 2000, and since 2000, I've been heavily involved in clinical trials. Currently, we are involved with these different networks, which are in and out of pediatrics and now extend into adult care and so forth. And then, of course, Danny has one of these, and I have one of these. I copied this approach because Danny's the only one that had an announcement in the paper. The Hopkins Tufts people kept themselves sort of quiet about this, but this is the big Trial Innovation Center for the CTSA program. So what are the lessons? Why do I show you this thing? It's like a 45-year to 50-year history there. And the issue is there were very distinct areas of research, and each of them sort of built upon the previous ones. My basic science research experience taught me experimental design in the setting where you can control the experimental design. Eventually, I developed a sweet spot, which was in pediatric critical care and emergency medicine data coordination. I expanded out from that into adult studies, but the third bullet that's on here is what I want you to remember, which is there is a huge amount of luck in research funding and getting research accomplished. I mean, huge. You can have a grant go into a study section, it can be triaged or streamlined. You can turn that grant around with minimal changes if you're gutsy and sometimes see it come back with a 4th percentile score. Same study section, different mood, person that reviewed it got up on a different side of the bed than they did the first time. Incredible amount of luck. And for those of you that look at mock study sections or ever go to a study section, you'll see that it takes 3 minutes to destroy what it took you 9 months to read, if they even spend 3 minutes talking about it. So huge amount of luck, being in the right place at the right time, and that's the goal that you should all have, which is either if you're a young person, you should be in the right place. If you're an older person, you should be helping the younger people get into the right place. The opportunity of a lifetime comes about every 2 weeks, and you just need to be ready for it. So when those opportunities come along, you go after it. And I think part of our job, I'm talking to the more senior people in the room, is really to assure that our young physicians are in the right place so they can be lucky, because that's what it all comes down to. Now here's one approach, is to join networks and collaborative groups, and this is a mixed solution. I'm involved heavily with networks, and there's theoretical scientific advantages. You have experts in the room that can collaborate with each other. There are infrastructure advantages. If you have a data coordinating center, that's an infrastructure advantage. You have an immense infrastructure advantage here at DCRI. But there are difficulties in implementation, and there's a whole bunch of Danny Benjamins in one room, and they're not the same person, and they're all saying different things. Just imagine the cacophony that you have in a situation like that. So you have very type A individuals who are very accomplished. You put them in a room and you say, be a team. It's not that easy to accomplish. But the scientific advantages are you've got groups of scientists who are relatively small or smart. It provides the expertise for people to collaborate and stir the ideas, and there's the potential for development of young investigators. And I do think that it's useful for young investigators to get an opportunity to go to steering committee meetings and see what happens in those places. They will either be happy or unhappy at what they see. These are the infrastructure advantages, which I've already said, and these are the things that are part of the bricks and mortar of this building here. But the difficulties are that, like I said, the people get selected because they're extremely accomplished, and if they're extremely accomplished as soloists, they're not always extremely collaborative as team players. The scientific agenda is not particularly coherent. Investigator membership changes. Our NIH-funded ICU network has had 3 renewals, and each time we lost 50% of our sites. So you had turnover of that, and whether you think that's good or bad, I'll leave for other discussions. And there's always too little money. There's different financial structures, and these are different types of networks. Our PCAR network is an emergency medicine network. We have to write an NIH grant for every protocol that's executed in that network. The network provides research coordinators for all the sites, but no protocol funds. The more typical NIH networks have protocol funds that get divvied out by the steering committee, or you take different networks and we put together the THAPCA trials, which I talked about this morning at Grand Rounds. These were NHLBI funded trials that took 2 networks together to leverage them. And there are a host of different ways that networks are set up. Sometimes they're reused, sometimes they're not reused, and so forth. And then there's this ultimate monster called the Trial Innovation Network, and this is the one for which your institution is one of the Trial Innovation Centers, and our institution is one of the Trial Innovation Centers. There are 3 of them, and the idea is somehow the 67 CTSA institutions and their 800 affiliated hospitals are going to be a superhighway for clinical research. And I can say inside of this building, there's enough realism in this building to know that this is probably not a very easy thing to accomplish. So I'm going to switch gears now. That's the advantage of networks, that's the advantage of large groups, and that's the advantage of getting large teams together and having infrastructure. But I want to talk about some basic things about research and how we preserve ourselves and how we view the horizon with respect to research. I got an MBA 20 years ago, and don't ask me my motivations, but I decided to commute between Wharton and Salt Lake City. So every 2 weeks I commuted. And you're going to go to MBA school, but it's going to be much, much faster. So we could cover things like accounting and finance, and some of the people in this room have to do this on a regular basis. Operations management, you all probably do every day. When you develop a protocol, when you get better at developing a protocol, when you realize how not to write certain sections, how not to build databases, you're doing operations management. But I want to talk primarily about microeconomics and strategy. And I say sort of because if there are any microeconomists in the room, they will want to kill me. We're in a competitive market, and I think you don't know what a competitive market is if you haven't taken microeconomics. I think you have a rough idea. There's competition and there's markets. But basically, our industry consists of medical schools, researchers, if you like, and we're the people that provide supply. A supply of our intellectual capacity, supply of ideas, a supply of people who are willing to do whatever the NIH tells them to do, and the NIH has the ideas. But we're competing for funds, and so we're the suppliers. This is called a demand curve, and I hope you appreciate that these axes are completely backwards. You would say that as the price varies, as the price goes up, the quantity that people would buy goes down. And that's what this graph shows. But economists, for some peculiar reason, decided that the X and Y axes should be reversed. So everything you know about plots has the variable on the x-axis as what drives the variable on the y-axis, but in economics, it's variables on the y-axis drive the variable on the x-axis. So what this says is that price P1, which is the highest price, the amount of quantity of demand is the least. Because you can see that it's the farther to the left. Q1 is much less than Q3. And as the price drops on something, the demand goes up for it. So that's the demand curve. And that's pretty much right. And you look at people like Apple, or companies like Apple, I should say, it's sort of a Freudian slip for us to say people like Apple. It's like talking to your phone and thinking it's a person. So the iPhone X is going to come out now, and it's $999, and it's plus if you get a decent operating one, it probably costs $1,500. And so this price is really pretty high. There's going to be a certain amount of demand for that, and some people are going to buy it. But that's out here. So the demand is here. It's Q1. Those are early adopters. They got enough money, and they care about Apple stuff. It's like a religion. They'll buy it. That will stop happening, and eventually the price will start to drop. The price will drop maybe because they introduce a new phone next year. The price will drop, and it will suck up more demand, and there will be increasingly more demand. So as the price drops on a commodity, demand goes up. Now the supply curve is the opposite, and you have quantity again on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. But as the price drops on something, fewer people want to supply it. Because if the price is really high and you know you can make a killing, then you want to be the seller, and other people can observe you and say, oh, that seller is making a lot of money, and so I'm going to become a seller too. And so what happens is as the price is up, you have a lot of supply. So there's a huge amount of supply, but as the price drops, the suppliers will provide less. They won't be interested in it. And this is what a supply and demand curve intersection looks like, and these are curved because these curves really are never straight lines. And if you open a microeconomics textbook, you'll find all kinds of these curves. And the idea is you have a demand curve here, and intersects a supply curve, and at the intersection, that's the price. And that's the price that the commodity will be at. And you'll notice, for instance, if you are in a busy air travel location, the prices between airlines are virtually the same. It's very difficult for them to differentiate, because if they go outside of that, you go to a different airline. And they compete to get to this, and this is the equilibrium point. And the amount spent is P times Q, so the amount in the lower left-hand corner is the amount that's spent on the commodity. Now, here's the NIH spending history from 1992 to 2011. And I want you to see that down here in 1992, which is on the far left, the budget of the NIH was $10 billion. So 1992, $10 billion. And there's a period of time on here called the doubling period between 1999 and 2003, when it went from approximately $14 billion to $28 billion. And our budget currently is about $32 billion. This is a more updated graph that doesn't start in 1992. It starts in 1998. You see this blip of red, which is the ERA funding. These were the shovel-ready programs. You were supposed to be ready to instantaneously cure health by having more money. But this is the budget of the NIH. And what you'll see is there was an increase of this budget. Now I want to talk about what is the price when we're talking about price and supply here. The price is the amount of return or the amount of money at which a supplier is willing to provide something. That's us. Product is a grant proposal. The price is also the amount that the consumer will pay. So that's basically how much the NIH is willing to give us, or industry is willing to give us, or the American Heart Association, and so forth. From a supplier standpoint, that is from our standpoint, the price or the payoff has to be enough that we'll keep doing it. If it's not enough that we'll keep doing it, then we'll quit. We can't lose money on every item, a tiny bit, and make it up in volume. That's how you go broke, right? And if the cost of production exceeds the price, then I'll stop doing it. And finally, if the cost of production is low compared to the price, I'll start doing it because I want to get rich. How does this translate into grants? Well, the price is really the amount of money that you get for a given amount of effort for putting in grant proposals. And, you know, if an institution is willing to fund somebody 50% of their free time for 3 years to prepare grant proposals, and there's a payoff, they'll keep doing it. If there's a loss, they'll stop doing it. So that's an issue there. But what is the economic cost? It's the time to write grants. If the pay line is real low, you have to rewrite the grants 3 times. If it's really low, 50% of your faculty are writing grants that they never get. the cost becomes too high, and you can redeploy that person, especially a physician, into the clinic where they generate revenue and they're done with research. The price also includes the emotional anguish. I know young investigators that get a grant review back and they got a score of 45. And they're despondent, and then I find out they got a score of 45 and I write them a congratulatory letter from the vice chair's office about, you got scored. And then you try to get them back on the horse and you try to get them to do this and you try to get them to revise the grant so that they can eventually get funded. But there's a lot of emotional load in doing this, and so you get committed to your project. You wrote the best grant that's never been funded, and all of a sudden, so individuals will quit. They'll just quit. They'll say, I don't need this. If the success rate is higher, if the pay line's higher, there's fewer rewrites. There's more success. It's like a golf shot. If you hit really one good golf shot, that'll keep you going through 9 holes of missing the ball in the first swing. And that's what it is here. So let's go back to the supply and demand curve. I have price on the y-axis there, and I already explained it to you. Now what happens if I increase the demand suddenly, like Congress did? Then I shift this red curve to the right. And if my supply is not changed, the price went up because the equilibrium point shifted. And you can see P2 is the price if I shift the demand without shifting the supply curve. And that's functionally what happened. NIH budget goes up by $2 billion. You don't suddenly have an increase in supply of the equivalent of the people necessary to write the grants. The price goes up. So we're going to do something which is where the microeconomists would probably have me killed, which is we're going to make a substitution. I'm going to put pay line on the y-axis instead of price. And pay line's a reasonable surrogate because it really is the overall return that an institution or a group of investigators might get for a certain amount of effort. And so when you do that, you're going to shift the amount of grants that can be bought, and then you're going to wait for the suppliers, us, to do what happens next, and you'll see what happens next. So here we are, 1994, on the left-hand demand curve going to 2000. There was a complete doubling of the amount of money, but the infrastructure was not doubled, and so our supply curve, the blue curve, was relatively constant. And you'll see that the functional pay line went up. So your pay line goes up here, and the amount of money spent, which is the area of that box, the amount of money spent is more. I mean, this was a heyday when people were facing this situation. So what happened? Well, congressional increases in the budget, and institutions watch, they observe. Duke, like any other institution, added buildings. You recruited young faculty, you said, we can get grants because they're paying at the 25th, 30th percentile. So you get an army of grant writers, you build some new buildings, you teach better grant writing, and things are good for a couple of years. But eventually everybody has done that, and now your supply curve has shifted. So our supplier capacity has gone up, and it's gone over to the right. And so now you see that there's a new equilibrium point because I had my good pay line here, right there, but now I'm going to be down here. Now what happens if the supply of grant writers is now huge and growing, but then the NIH levels its budget? It stops increasing the budget, but inflation doesn't stop. Then you're going to have a demand curve which is functionally shifting back to the left from where it went. I'm going to show you a curve that has 3 curves on it, and you're going to see that it went back to the left. And that's the middle red curve, and you'll see that its equilibrium point where it crosses the supply curve is lower than the original one. So here you have a situation where a perturbation was made, a massive infusion of funds, the supplier capacity and infrastructure massively went up, and then when they stopped inflating the NIH budget on an annual basis, the demand goes back down and we get squeezed. The number of suppliers has more than doubled. This is a graph over the same time period from 1998 to the present. The number of applicants has doubled, and that's why money is tight. And you could say the NIH should just keep increasing the budget, but in fact that won't work. That's a Ponzi scheme, because eventually, well, I left that slide in twice. Eventually the same thing's going to happen. You're going to get more applicants. So the message is you have to be willing to compete. Now the NIH is not dead. These are two slides. This one shows a budget for research project grants of $17.837 billion. And this is 2016. This is post-Trump, $17.927 billion. Now there's inflation. Inflation is not very high, but the sky didn't fall. This money is still there, and you can do a lot of research for this. Equilibrium always takes time, and eventually people are going to quit writing grants. The people that get discouraged will quit writing grants because the load is too high, the redeployability is too high. And our goal, and I think the goal that we have here at the DCRI, is for our young faculty to survive this. And you have to be able to just keep on competing and keep on moving at it. And so you want to be in the business. Continuing to increase the budget year after year does not work. All right, it's a Ponzi scheme. I can just keep adding a couple billion to the NIH every single year for the next 20 years, and we as institutions will add tens of thousands of investigators that will compete for that money. It will always be tight. And I've been in this business for 40 years. Money has never been loose, even when it was good. When I told you how good it was, nobody said, oh, money is loose right now. It's always tight. And our problem is there's a huge risk we'll lose physician scientists because they can quit. You can make more money if you quit. If you stop writing grants, you'll make more money. That's a pretty easy decision to make. So the question is, am I a pessimist or an optimist? And this is where I want to have the sound on here. And see if this works.
Now, I know there have been some rumors going around that the bank is no longer funding us. Well, I am here to put those rumors to rest. They are true. In terms of money, we have no money. So how will we get to the moon? The answer is clear. We won't.
Now this goes on. There's a little whatever they call those things that are in the ground there that takes some money and hands them a coin and offers to do this. But you have to decide, are you a pessimist or an optimist? And obviously he wasn't too optimistic at this. But I will tell you, I'm unequivocally an optimist. Pessimists, I think, don't try to control their future. I think pessimists have already given up. And if you believe you can control your future, then I think you should consider yourself thinking that you're an optimist. You can have an influence on your future. And we need to talk about that, and we need a strategy that preserves physician scientists that looks at that. And a couple of things that need to be looked at are what are the motivations for us doing research, and are those motivations still there? And if they are still there, then we've got something to work with. And then how do you deal with fellows and young faculty? And what are the motivations? Are the motivations for a young faculty member to make more money? That's clearly ridiculous. From an institutional standpoint, every K award that's awarded is a loss to the institution because none of you are being paid at the rate of pay that would make the K award break even. So it's a loss, it's an investment by the institution that you're going to do well later on when you learn how to write wildly successful grants. And if you are wildly successful, there's a salary cap at the NIH and across the federal government of $187,000. So that probably sounds like a veritable fortune to the younger in the audience. It sounds like a pay cut for full professors who have been here for 20 years, and that's a problem. If the institution is paying you $300,000 a year, then they're losing a certain amount of money every time there's an NIH grant. So it depends on what your institution wants. What about your chairman told you to do it? Is that a motivation? And I can spend a lot of time talking about this, but I would simply say that if you as a faculty member negotiated a job that included academic work, that included non-income generating activities, then you should be thinking about writing grants because your chairman told you to do it. because you bought the poison pill. You said, I want 20%, 30%, 40% protected time to be academic, then eventually the piper is going to have to be paid. So they're going to come back. But the real reason is, this is my real reason, competitive spirit. I write grants for fun. I wrote the TIC application that got us $28 million purely for sport. And our CTSA said, you might not get it. I said, I don't play this game to talk about I don't get it. I do this for sport. But most of you should do it for this reason, fire in the belly. Fire in the belly is you get up every day and you are bothered by something you're doing clinically. Or you wake up in the middle of the night and you're passionate about something, you really want to study it. This is really what you want to do. And I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek when I say that I don't care, like I didn't do the TIC completely for fun. I care about clinical trials. I want to do clinical trials more efficiently. And I am up at night thinking about how clinical trials get executed. So putting those things together, a competitive spirit and fire in the belly, is the ideal combination. And I know a number of people, and Danny's one of the people, I know Danny pretty well. He's one of those people that also does this for sport. And when you get to that point, that's good. When you're young, you're terrified. Am I going to get promoted? Am I going to get tenure? And I understand it's not that easy to say you should be doing this for sport. Why should fellows or faculty who are young be interested in research? Do all of your colleagues know that you have fun doing what you're doing here at the DCRI? Because if they think you're miserable, that's not really going to be very, very positive. And so when you have senior leaders that get up and say, the funding is so damn tight, I'm just going to give up. What's the message that sends to somebody who's 35 years old, who hasn't figured out how to get his first grant or her first grant? My first NIH grant was when I was age 50. And, I've had a ton of grants, but I now had a ton of NIH grants. My first independent NIH grant was at age 50. Ira Chaffetz got a score last week that indicates that he's going to be a funded NIH investigator. He's in his 50s. That'd be his first NIH grant. All right, so you have to be persistent about this, and we have to make people know that we're having fun doing this. So when the funding is tight, you say, funding is tight, but we got to compete. We got to keep going after this. We're going to compete, and we're going to win because we keep competing. Now, what are the demotivators? Well, it isn't just pediatric physicians, it's physicians are perceived as having a weakness compared to PhDs. And that's exactly right, we do. We're not completely trained. We haven't been trained in research the way PhDs have been. Research faculty are sometimes perceived as miserable because they're working 100% of their 168-hour work week and they're ruining their lives. And I remember in one meeting that we had 20 years ago in our department, people said the research faculty are all divorced. And I turned around and I said, 90% of the physicians in this room are divorced. Never occurred to them. And it turns out that if you look at physicians don't have a real good track record. You don't have to ruin your life to be a research faculty member. You're fully capable of ruining your life by being a physician. So what's our context? We need to teach people that the context of the physician scientist is your advantage. Your advantage is you have patients. I said that this morning. You're in clinically driven divisions most of the time. You're weird. That's why you have the DCRI, so weird people can come together in the same room. You say, other people want to do clinical research. Most places don't have this. And so I run a retreat, which I'm going to run this week, and Kevin Watt's going to be coming to that retreat. He's in our program. And these are ICU docs and trauma surgeons from all over the country who compete for K-12 grants. And they uniformly get in that room and say, I did not know there were other weird people like me. Because they're in clinically driven departments and divisions where normal is taking care of patients. Honorable and normal is taking care of patients. And when you're doing research, you're somehow aberrant. If you're going to compete with non-physicians, you have to change the rules. You have to change the rules so that you use your strength to compete against that full-time PhD researcher who's an assistant professor. At our Department of Biochemistry, when they advertise for an assistant professor, they get 500 applications. And they don't appoint anybody as an assistant professor if they don't already have an R01. If I'm in the Department of Pediatrics and Critical Care and I need to recruit a faculty member and I post the job and you do that here, you might get 20 or 30 applicants. I might get 5 or 10 applicants. So you're competing with a different species when you compete with lab PhD scientists. And you will lose if you try to compete with them on the same playing field. You have patience and you have clinical knowledge, and they do not. So that's your advantage. You need to play it. In my example, I run data coordinating centers. I cannot gun against DCRI. Well, I can try, but that's just for sport. I certainly can't gun against Westat, RTI, and all these Beltway bandits if I try to do it on statistics and databases. Because they've all got bigger computers than I've got. The only way I could go after this is by saying we're going to take physician leadership and biostatistical leadership and combine it. And we're going to make networks come up faster because of the physician leadership. And so your RTI team is going to be fantastic at doing statistics, but they don't know anything about medicine. They don't know how to ask the questions, and they can't fight back with the investigators. Well, that's our whole approach. We've been able to take on Westat and RTI. I know we've defeated them in a couple of contests. And that's what you do. You change the rules. You say, here are the rules I want to play by. So as physician scientists, your rule shouldn't be to take on the PhD face on face. Your approach should be, I'm still a physician, and I'm going to leverage that strength. Time management. Yesterday I talked to the fellows, and one of the things that came up is time management. And time management is huge. I don't write grants at night, and I don't write grants on weekends. I write grants during the week, and that's what you should learn to do. And you have to have absolute meticulous time management in order to do that. And I think that you should teach this if you're a teacher, and you should learn it if you're young. I'm not going to go through all of the stuff. I do work on weekends a little bit, but I don't write grants on weekends. And there's macro and there's micro time management. The deadline for NIH grants has not changed since 1968. You should be able to make your clinical call schedule not put you on service for the 4 weeks before the deadline you're targeting. There's just some looking forward at a macro level and figuring out how to do that. At a micro level, I went through this yesterday with the fellows and said, make an hourly grid of your weeks and protect time, block time out so that time doesn't get filled. Vacuum, is abhorred by nature, and so if you have empty time, it'll get filled. Somebody will fill that. So if you fill it with your own tasks, you'll be able to manage. And I told people yesterday to get the book, Getting Things Done. Grant writing is teachable. It's very teachable. So, we have grant writing workshops twice a year. We go to Deer Valley and we take our faculty up there and we make them write. And you only get good at writing grants by writing grants, and it can be taught. You can't just take somebody and say, you got a good idea, go write a grant. And as a thought exercise, take an hour and just write a new Spec Ames page. Force yourself, sit in a room without your phone, without your computer. I even say you should use yellow lined paper and a pencil, not a pen, pencil, because then you can erase it. And then it says rinse and repeat every 3 to 6 months. I think this is an exercise people should do. Try to generate ideas. Force yourself to generate ideas. And then persistence. I want to tell you about, I already told you about Dean's Law, but I want to tell you the story of Prashant Mahajan. Prashant Mahajan is at Ann Arbor. He had this poster a few years ago. These are febrile infants. They decided to go after biosignatures, and so they collected RNA on these kids, and then they ran chips, and they came up with a signature for a bacterial and a non-bacterial signature. And it came out in JAMA last year, Association of Biosignatures. I bring this up to ask you, where did this start? And this started a long time ago. In 2004, he came to a grant writing workshop, and he wanted to repeat, for those of you who are pediatricians, you know the Rochester criteria for the febrile infant. High white count, high fever, they look bad, and then apply clinical judgment. And so he attended this, and I made an editorial comment that if 5 previous attempts to do this had failed, that it was hopeless to try to repeat this. He thought I meant his grant was hopeless, which I sort of did. and he left dejected. But then he met a molecular biologist in 2006 and also realized we'd need thousands of RNA specimens in order to do this, and he embarked on this. And this is a series of quotes from this young guy who's not so young anymore, but he was quoting me, and he said he was glad that I told him it sucks. He said, if the idea sucks, you should say it sucks. And the bottom one says that the biggest mistake a mentor can make is by not telling their trainee their idea is bad. They need to tell them to get a better idea, because if you say, well, that idea is sort of okay, go think about it for the next 3 months, they just waste 3 months, because you know in your heart the idea is bad, you should get a new idea. So he wrote a targeted issue grant for $300,000 to start the project, and then he wrote more grants and more grants. We now have 7,000 RNA specimens on febrile infants. This is that guy's NIH reporter page. He's got multiple R01s. He got a better idea, and then he got steered into a collaboration with a molecular biologist. He's a PEDS emergency medicine division chief, and he's got multiple R01s as the main PI. And then what are our tactics and momentum? Form teams. I already said that that was a possibility. If you're the leader of a department, like I am a vice chair, my job from the dean's office is increase funding. Well, I have to identify my racehorses. I have to find which faculty am I going to put the resources into and how am I going to make them succeed. Try to set up an infrastructure that other people can't replicate, and then make sure that your good science is matched by good grant writing. Grant writing can be taught. Grant writing, I know, is taught here, and I've seen some grants from this place, and they're unbelievable. So what's my vision for the future? Is clinical research dead? I don't think it's dead. Alan Guttmacher is a friend of mine. He was the director of NICHD, and he made the comment to me at one point, a lot of science can be done for $32 billion. So even though it's a flat budget, you can still do a lot of science. And I would simply say research will be dead for those who quit doing it. So if you quit doing it, yes, you won't get any more grants. And then the future of our scientific career as clinical researchers, we cannot ignore basic science. And this is a lesson that has been driven home to me by several program officers at the NIH. One thing that program officers at the NIH share is a love of the NIH and a love of science. And even if they do clinical research, they love laboratory research, they love animal models, they love science. There's no other conceivable reason you would ever want to work at the NIH. It is a cuckoo's nest. So you're there because you love science and you love health improvement. We can't ignore genomics and proteomics. We can't hide behind we know how to do an RCT or we've learned the Goldilocks design with Bayesian statistics for sample size or things like that. We need to care about the basic science because that's what's going to happen in the next few years. How is a physician going to handle the patient in 10 years who has the entire genome sequence in a subcutaneous chip under their wrist? You're going to scan this thing and you're going to have the genome. If you don't have any idea what that means, you're not going to be qualified or ready to take advantage of that, and that's where clinical research is going to be. And then there's health services research. Health services research, these databases really aren't that big. I mean, I'm used to big databases, but health services research databases right now are in the millions of records, maybe tens of millions. But think about the entire EHR and all the genomics and all the imaging data and all the vital signs that are now being collected in intensive care units, including the waveforms being sampled 100 times a second. And you have so much data, you can't even move the data. You have to move the processing to the data. So we're going to have people that really, really understand high-performance computations. So optimists control their future, and pessimists already gave up. That's my sort of final message. And this is my friend from the ICU, and that's the look he gave me when I walked into the ICU. He was stunned. He's not sunsetting, for those of you that are pediatricians. I would be happy to, I ended almost on time, so we have 15 minutes for discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. I got to sit?
You can sit.
No, I don't sit. I can't sit.
Are we on? Yeah. Okay, perfect. I actually learned this lesson yesterday. He told me that he doesn't allow anyone to sit on rounds because if you're sitting, it takes longer. You make everyone stand, you get through it quicker.
That's right. No coffee on rounds either.
So thank you for that talk. And I'd like to open up the discussion section, but I wanted to start with a question. And I'm intrigued by when you said, the medical student or the resident that does the dreaded chart review that seems to be where we already start. And as a distinguished teacher and mentor to a lot of young scientists, I'm interested in what are sort of those things that you look at in terms of, because the chart review, I think, can turn off a lot of people from the start, and this is not what I want to do my whole life kind of thing. What are the things that you look for, those sort of starting projects that you give, or steps that you take to try to put that fire in the belly early in these young scientists?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I think the one thing that I run into is with our fellows in the ICU is they want to look at an old database. They want to look at FIS, or they want to look at HCUP databases, or they want to look at some kind of database, or they want to go to do a medical record review. And our medical record is mostly on paper still, but we do have an electronic data warehouse at Intermountain Healthcare, which owns our children's hospital. All the labs are in there, and the medications and the diagnoses and some things like that. So they want to get their data on 1,000 bronchiolitis patients and sort of just beat that data to death until it confesses to some crime and write a paper about it. And when they're getting ready to write it, they discover that they don't have the data elements that they really needed. And one of the things that I encourage people to do is think about an observational cohort study that you can do prospectively anytime you're thinking about a medical record review. So anytime you're really thinking about, I think I'll go back and look at the last 100 years of chylothoraces, you got to really recognize that only the last 2 years worth of chylothoraces are probably relevant because the care of that condition has changed so much. And if you're a first-year fellow in a 3-year fellowship, you could accumulate that series of chylothorax patients with the correct data, prospectively obtained so that it's accurate data, and then learn how to do a prospective observational cohort study. I'm trying to get our fellows to do some collaborative sort of fellow projects where a fellow might start a project that might not finish until the next class of fellows comes in. So if you're doing something that's rare and it takes 5 years to accumulate it, then you're sort of putting in your chit at the beginning with the promise that when they finish the series and write the paper, you'll be remembered and put back in as an author in the future. But I do think that almost always a prospective cohort study is always better than a medical record review. And I think that the other thing is sometimes you'll discover that it's faster to do the prospective cohort study for 2 years and get it published than it is to do the medical record study for 6 months and spend 3 years not getting it published because nobody will publish it. So that's one example. The other approach is generally to find somebody that's doing something that they're excited about. And that's why I like the model that's used here with the fellowship program that's here. I mean, you get assigned and you're going to start working with teams that are doing clinical research. You're stuck on a team, you have to write a protocol you don't want to write, or a chlorohydrate review that you didn't want to write. You just throw people in the water and they start swimming, and there's faculty in that water that are going to tell you how to proceed, and they're going to give you experience with that. And then I guess the final ingredient would be to try to find something that trainee can publish. Because if you can't publish the research you do as a resident medical student or a fellow, then you don't get it in your blood that there's a reward. And that first paper really, really matters a lot.
Thank you, excellent talk. Your economics lecture prompted a question. I'm one of those annoying PhDs, so you can frame your answer however you want to. I recently went to a lecture by Mike Lauer at NIH about reproducibility, scientific, which is a hot topic for him.
Right.
And he said they did an analysis of their grant scheme and the awards they made. And he said they had unknowingly, actually, he believes, they've proven they've actually contributed to the reproducibility problem by undercutting all their grants by 10, 15%. In other words, so almost every research project they were funding was underpowered implicitly, particularly animal experiments. That's what he went focused on. So I'd be interested in how that fits into your microeconomics lecture. Is that something that you think that was a conscious decision on their part, or just a function of your law of supply and demand?
Well, I don't think that was an economic decision. I think an economic decision, they would have said if there's this many applicants and this many dollars, and that you let the chips fall where they should fall. And I think that would mean that some of those grants didn't get funded. And I think that's a perfect example of distortion of the market, because what they did is they said, well, we're going to chop 20% off of every grant so that we can fund 20% more R01s and get 20% more friends. And that's sort of the distortion that's there. And I agree with you completely that if you take a project and you say, well, yeah, we want you to do the project, congratulations, you got your grant. I mean, what happens to an investigator who gets an R01 no-go with an 8th percentile score on it? They're ecstatic. Then you say, we're going to take 20% away. Well, we've got a surgeon who's about to embark on a clinical trial, and I'm running the data coordinating center for it, and their budget wasn't adequate at 500. And they cut it to 420. I said, you should give it back. Well, you can imagine that he didn't give it back, and we're going to try to do a trial that was underfunded at 500,000. Now we're going to try to execute it for 420,000. And I think Lauer is right in some ways that we contribute to the problem of underpowered studies by doing that. I do think also, though, that the reproducibility issue, I think, has been really complicated by the complexity of our computations now. And so the best example is from your own institution. So the cancer scandal that was 10 years ago, if you go back and look at that, there really wasn't any evil intent here. There was a shift of one cell in an Excel spreadsheet that led to a completely wrong genomic analysis of breast tumor susceptibilities to chemotherapies. And then women were assigned to the wrong chemotherapy based on this biosignature. Now, the scandal had to do with the guy's background. He didn't have the background he was supposed to have. But the fact is that the computational pipeline for genomic analysis and for image analysis is extraordinarily complex. And so the inability to reproduce some of that is really problematic. I don't agree with Mike Lauer on the pessimism about why do so many trials fail, because I think he should expect that most trials will fail. I worked in an animal lab. In an animal lab, you can control everything. A patient in an intensive care unit is a very messy rat. Nothing is controlled. And so it's not really completely surprising to me that we're getting negative trials. I think there is a recognition now that we need to get trials on specific people that have specific SNPs with specific pathophysiologies with specific drugs in order for us to focus down, because we're trying to solve problems that are not soluble with sort of the old paradigm. The perfect example is the CAR T cells. CAR T cells are a miracle. I mean, if you really look at that, you take a specific tumor and you teach T cells to kill that tumor, and in the patients in whom it works, it cures them. And we have to keep a loaded gun of a monoclonal in the ICU so that we can shoot that in to turn off the T cells if they're too efficacious. And now there are a bunch of CAR T cell therapies out for multiple tumors. Well, it shouldn't really surprise us that beyond giving steroids for leukemia and radiation for Hodgkin's disease, those are pretty gross guns. But when we get down to the very specific hard problems of recalcitrant tumors and so forth, it's not going to be susceptible to simple trials. So I don't share the pessimism, or I don't think the NIH should feel so much guilt when they say a lot of our trials fail. Even if they're adequately powered, a lot of trials are going to fail. That's valuable information. But I do think the microeconomics is where the NIH distorted the market. Other questions?
I have one more. As I'm thinking about getting lucky in the world of research, and you mentioned that the sort of right opportunity, the big opportunity comes along every 2 weeks, and you just have to be ready for it. What would you say that looks like? Is it the right, maybe your top three? Is it the right mentorship, the right sort of papers under your belt, the right skill set? What are sort of those things that you're trying to build in order to be in that right place when it comes along?
I would say unequivocally mentorship. I think the most important thing you can do is either have or be a really good mentor. A mentor is going to slap you down if you go write something that's outside of the scope of what you're working on. A mentor is going to go to your department chair or your division chief and say, there's supposed to be 80% protection for this person, and you're not giving them 80% protection. A mentor is willing to sit down with you and tell you that your ideas suck, and then sort of help pick you up. They can let you go home and cry on your own, but then eventually you come back and you get a thicker skin. And a mentor is somebody who leads by example and is able to write papers and publications and write grants. Another thing to think about, though, is as a young trainee, this task looks daunting. It's like, you're at D-Day and you're on the beach and you have to walk up that thing. That's absurd. That's pretty daunting. You take it one step at a time, and I think if you don't have 3 papers, if you don't have 2 or 3 papers in your research area, don't worry about grants. There is no point in worrying about a grant. Any grant you try to write will fail. Just write papers. Just identify what you got to do. If you're at a certain stage, you got to write papers. And just stay focused on that. Don't worry about the grants until you've written some of the papers. And then after you've written some of the papers, you'll have some expertise that will make it easier for you to learn how to write grants. I also tell people in my department to stop messing around with $10,000 grants. More than $10,000 falls out of the division chief's pocket. If there's a project that needs $10,000 to do and it's a fellow level project or a young faculty member's level project, if it's a good idea, your department can pay for it. It's not worth the time to try to write a $10,000 grant, unless you can write it in a few hours because you know exactly how to write it. And I think sometimes that comes up. That's one of the grants that I wrote. I knew exactly how to write it. I wrote it in 13 days. And it was like slam dunk if you know how to do that. But I think a real problem for young faculty is this task looks so insurmountable that you just get frustrated. And so breaking it off and saying, well, for the next year and a half, I'm going to crank out these 4 manuscripts from the data that I've generated in the lab or in a clinical trial or from the dreaded chart review or whatever. That gives them an ability to focus. It's just like retention and tenure. If you're going to get on a tenure track in some institutions and you're going to get promoted and you're a young faculty member and you have 0 papers and they say you need 30 papers to become an associate professor, maybe more, but let's pretend 30 papers, and you don't have any, and you got maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years to do this in, people are really frustrated. They say, how am I ever going to do that? I said, divide it by 10. You got to crank out 3 papers a year on average for the next 10 years, or if it's a 7-year clock, you got to crank out a different number of papers, and collaborate with others so that you're writing papers, they're writing papers. You're collaborating with each other and you leverage each other. But break it down into a manageable step. What can I do this year that's going to advance me? And have some patience, because otherwise you look at this and say, I think somebody this morning said I have 250 papers or something like that. Well, I didn't think at the beginning of my career I was going to have 250 papers. But that happened because of these networks. So you got a machine that's enrolling patients in, I'm involved right now in 40 clinical trials. Those, I don't even think about those papers. They cross my desk, I read them over, and I send back to the author a couple of comments that are critical comments, and that's it. So there's a machine that gets going as you get more of an infrastructure. And you have a machine here at the DCRI that I think the young people can really leverage. The older people have already leveraged it and helped build this institution up. But take it one day at a time. I think that's really the issue.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking.
You're welcome.
reception.